December 1944, during the frozen nightmare of the Battle of the Bulge, a single rifle shot cracked through the freezing air outside a makeshift Red Cross medical tent on the outskirts of Bastogne, and a young American medic carrying boxes of blood plasma collapsed into the snow with a bullet hole burning through his heavy wool uniform jacket. But the shot had not come from the distant German positions across the snowy field, but rather from inside the hospital tent itself, directly behind the canvas flap marked with a large Red Cross symbol, where a hidden enemy had just shattered the oldest and most sacred rules of civilized warfare by turning a sanctuary for the wounded into a sniper's nest. Inside the tent, Sergeant William Hayes, a 31-year-old medic from a coal mining town in West Virginia who had survived the chaos of Normandy and the frozen meat grinder of Holland, stood with his hands shaking violently, not from fear, but from 4 days without sleep, and frostbite creeping into his knuckles, gripping a heavy steel trench knife just inches from the throat of the captive enemy, who lounged comfortably on a wooden crate, eating stolen American peaches from a tin can. And within hours, General George S. Patton would arrive to deliver what became known as the coldest punishment of World War II, a response so brutal and so perfectly calibrated to the crime that it would define the limits of military justice in the most desperate days of the European campaign. Lieutenant Hans Becker was 24 years old, a decorated sniper from the elite Fallschirmjäger paratrooper division who had been born into an aristocratic family in Berlin and spoke flawless English with a sharp, arrogant accent acquired during 2 years studying modern history at Oxford before the war. And he possessed an unshakable belief that the Third Reich was destined to rule, while viewing American forces as weak, uncultured fools who bound themselves to outdated moral codes that real warriors could exploit. He sat relaxed against the medical supply crate, wearing a spotless tailored winter parka over his uniform with a gleaming iron cross pinned proudly to his chest, his hands casually behind his head, and a smug smile plastered across his face as he stared down the trembling American medic, completely confident that his knowledge of international treaties made him absolutely untouchable under the Geneva Convention, which designated any building or tent flying the Red Cross flag as a neutral sanctuary that could not be attacked, and where wounded soldiers and medical personnel operated under strict immunity from combat operations. By late December 1944, the Ardennes forest had transformed into a freezing, blood-soaked landscape where the German army had launched its final desperate counteroffensive, catching the Allied lines completely by surprise and trapping the undersupplied American airborne divisions inside the vital crossroads town of Bastogne, where German artillery pounded the perimeter night and day, splintering dense pine trees into deadly wooden shrapnel that tore through wool uniforms while supply lines were severed, leaving field hospitals entirely short on blood plasma, clean bandages, and basic anesthesia. Medics worked under horrific conditions, performing complex amputations on wooden crates while canvas structures shook violently from nearby mortar blasts. And in this chaotic environment, the rules of civilized warfare began to rapidly deteriorate under the immense pressure of survival, as men froze to death in the snow, and specialized marksmen realized that American medical positions provided excellent vantage points with clear lines of sight across the battlefield. The Geneva Convention had established clear boundaries for medical facilities that European battlefield commanders had generally respected for years, treating hospitals as off-limits to direct combat. But as the German advance stalled and desperation grew into outright panic, some units began to abandon these traditional agreements, and other Allied officers across the European theater had often let these minor violations slide, viewing them as the unavoidable chaos of an active combat zone. Filing formal paperwork and moving their aid stations further back from the front lines rather than confronting the fundamental breakdown of military honor. That passive approach ended entirely on the day the fighting reached the outskirts of Bastogne, when Captain Donald Miller walked into the primary aid tent to check morning supply manifests and stopped dead in his tracks when he saw the German paratrooper lounging on the supply crate while Sergeant Hayes stood a few feet away with his trench knife trembling just inches from the prisoner's throat, his eyes wide with unvented fury as two infantrymen stood by the door with their rifles aimed directly at the captive's chest. Miller demanded to know what the German officer was doing inside a neutral medical facility, and Becker did not move his hands from behind his head as he smiled warmly and replied in his Oxford accent that he was enjoying some excellent American peaches from a tin, noting that the crackers were slightly stale but entirely acceptable given the circumstances. And when Miller asked if he was the one who fired the shot through the canvas that killed the young medic whose body lay bleeding on a cot across the tent, Becker shrugged casually and explained that war was an unfortunate business requiring efficiency, stating that the young man had been carrying supplies that could prolong the defense of the town and that eliminating him was a purely tactical decision to accelerate the inevitable American surrender. Miller took a step closer, his face turning bright red as he told the German that firing from inside a designated Red Cross station stripped him of any military honor and made him a common murderer. But Becker laughed softly and replied that honor was a concept for romantic novels, not for the Eastern Front or the frozen Ardennes. And he pointed out that under Article 26 of the Geneva Convention, he was now an unarmed person inside a recognized hospital, and they were legally required to provide him with food, shelter, and medical protection from the artillery. The report reached General George S. Patton within the hour, and the legendary commander arrived in his open-top jeep that roared through the drifting snow and skidded to a halt directly outside the canvas entry flaps, 4 polished stars gleaming on his helmet despite the gray, overcast sky, and his signature ivory-handled revolvers resting securely in their holsters on his belt. And when he walked in, unannounced, with his heavy boots crunching against the hard, frozen earth, the chaotic murmurs inside the medical tent ceased instantly as every man froze in place. Patton studied the scene coldly, his eyes moving from the blood-splattered cots to the uninjured German paratrooper who remained seated on the medical supply crate, and he stood directly over the prisoner with his voice exceptionally quiet, yet carrying to every corner of the silent tent, as he asked Becker if he knew where he was standing, and the German nodded slightly while maintaining his relaxed posture and replied that he was in an American field medical station, currently acting as a non-combatant under international supervision. Patton asked if the prisoner had carried a weapon into the perimeter, and Becker stated that he had discarded his rifle outside before surrendering, which legally left him unarmed and under the absolute protection of the Geneva Convention. And when Patton asked if the paratrooper had fired upon the medic who was currently bleeding on the operating table, Becker smiled thinly and answered that he had performed his duty as a soldier of the Reich, adding that the rules of war now forced the Americans to protect him from the elements. Patton said nothing for a long moment, his eyes boring into the young German officer, and then he spoke in a tone that remained dangerously soft as he told Becker that he understood his elaborate legal framework perfectly and recognized that the paratrooper believed he had discovered a clever loophole in the rules of civilized combat, acknowledging that Becker viewed the Red Cross painted on the canvas roof not as a symbol of mercy, but as a convenient shield to hide his cowardice. He told the German that international law was written to preserve the dignity of brave men who faced each other honestly on the battlefield, and was never intended to provide a safe haven for murderers who used a sanctuary for the sick as a personal hunting blind. and he pointed out that while Becker sat warmly in the tent eating stolen rations, an American medic was fighting for his life because of a deliberate cold-blooded ambush from behind a hospital curtain, a violation so profound that it struck at the very heart of what separated soldiers from common criminals. Patton stated that the German army had spent years disregarding treaties whenever it suited their territorial ambitions, violating the sovereignty of neutral nations, and conducting campaigns of systematic brutality against civilian populations. Yet their officers always ran to the protection of legal textbooks the very moment they were caught and cornered, claiming rights they had spent the entire war denying to others. And he made it clear that this particular American officer was not interested in playing that hypocritical game. He told Becker that if he wished to renounce the responsibilities of a true soldier by hiding among the wounded and exploiting the protections meant for men who fought with honor, he would no longer receive the privileges of one. And he gave the German two distinct options to resolve the matter: stand up right now and face an immediate military tribunal for war crimes where his actions would be judged by a panel of officers who understood exactly what he had done and would show him no mercy, or step outside into the freezing wilderness and let the natural elements judge his ultimate fate in the same way he had judged the wounded soldiers who died in the snow because the medical supplies they desperately needed never arrived. And he gave him exactly 5 seconds to choose his path. Becker remained entirely silent, his arrogant smile finally fading as he realized the American general was not playing a bureaucratic game. And Patton did not wait for the German to reply, but turned on his heel and issued a series of sharp, quiet commands to the 2 infantrymen standing by the canvas door, ordering them to strip the prisoner of his heavy insulated paratrooper parka, and they tore away his lined winter gloves and forced him out of his thick, sheepskin-lined leather boots until within moments, the arrogant lieutenant was left standing on the freezing dirt floor in nothing but his thin wool underfatigues and threadbare socks. Becker began to shiver violently, his face turning an asymmetric shade of pale as the raw Ardennes draft rushed through the open tent flap, and the reality of his situation finally penetrated the arrogance that had protected him from understanding the consequences of his actions. And Miller and Hayes watched in absolute silence as the guards grabbed the prisoner by his shoulders and marched him out into the swirling white blizzard, pushing him past the perimeter defenses where American soldiers watched with grim satisfaction, and leaving him completely exposed on a snow-covered logging trail that led deep into the dense, dark pine forest where temperatures had dropped well below freezing, and survival without proper winter gear was nearly impossible for even the most experienced woodsman. The German officer stumbled forward into the snow, his thin socks immediately soaking through as the freezing water penetrated the threadbare fabric, and within minutes, his feet would begin the process of frostbite that would eventually cost him his leg, the tissue freezing solid as blood flow constricted and ice crystals formed in the cellular structure of his extremities, causing damage that no amount of medical care could fully repair once the process had advanced beyond a certain point. Patton walked to the edge of the camp and called out to the retreating figure, telling him that if he managed to survive the sub-zero temperatures and find his way back to the German lines, he was perfectly welcome to file a formal complaint regarding American hospitality. And the surrounding soldiers watched the shivering paratrooper disappear into the blinding white wilderness, where the freezing wind cut through his thin uniform like knives and the snow quickly covered his tracks. The punishment was brutally simple and perfectly calibrated to the crime. Becker had used the warmth and safety of a protected medical sanctuary to kill an unarmed man carrying supplies to save lives. And now he would face the same freezing death he had inflicted on countless wounded soldiers who bled out in the snow because the plasma they needed never arrived. Stripped of the protections he had claimed to cherish and forced to survive on his own merit, in an environment that showed no mercy to the weak or the dishonorable. Lieutenant Hans Becker miraculously survived the freezing temperatures of the Ardennes forest by crawling back to a German scouting patrol 3 days after Patton released him, and he spent the remainder of the war in a military hospital recovering from severe frostbite that eventually resulted in the amputation of his lower right leg, a permanent physical reminder of the moment when his arrogance and his abuse of the rules of war met an American general who refused to play his game. Following the Allied victory, Becker returned to a ruined Berlin, where he worked as a low-level clerk in a local administrative office until his death in 1991, and he remained bitter about his treatment until his final days, often writing letters to international legal organizations complaining about the violation of his rights under the Geneva Convention, never acknowledging that he had forfeited those rights the moment he turned a hospital into a fortress and a symbol of mercy into a weapon. Sergeant William Hayes returned to West Virginia after the German surrender, leaving the horrors of the European theater behind him and going back into the coal mines where he used his wartime medical experience to establish safety protocols that protected generations of young miners in his hometown. And he lived a quiet, unassuming life, rarely speaking about the freezing days in Bastogne. And when he died in his sleep in 1978, the trench knife he had held that morning was buried alongside him, a silent witness to a moment of ultimate restraint when a man who had every reason to take vengeance instead stepped back and let justice be served through other means. General Patton never included the incident in his official operational reports or personal memoirs, viewing the encounter as a simple matter of battlefield discipline rather than a historic event, though he kept a brief, handwritten summary of the encounter locked in his personal desk drawer until his sudden death in December 1945, and in a letter written to his wife just 2 days after the confrontation, he noted that a man who uses a house of mercy as a fortress has already forfeited his place among civilized human beings. Some historians have argued that Patton's decision to cast the German paratrooper out into the sub-zero elements without winter gear violated standard military conventions regarding the treatment of captured personnel, contending that a commander should never bypass formal military tribunals even when facing an explicit and provocative violation of a neutral medical sanctuary, while others have defended the general's swift action as a necessary tactical decision that restored order and maintained the psychological boundaries of human decency during a chaotic siege where the normal processes of military justice were impossible to implement. What is certain is that the medical tent remained an unmolested sanctuary for the duration of the battle, and no other German sniper attempted to use a Red Cross station as a hunting blind after word spread through both armies about what had happened to the arrogant lieutenant who thought he was untouchable, and the incident became a quiet legend among American medics who saw it as proof that even in the darkest moments of the war, when survival seemed to require abandoning every principle of civilization, there were still commanders willing to draw a line and enforce it, regardless of the personal cost or the complications it created for diplomatic relations after the fighting ended. The coldest punishment of World War II was not the harshest or the most violent, but it was perhaps the most perfectly calibrated to its crime, a punishment that took a man who had exploited the warmth and safety of a protected sanctuary to commit murder and forced him to face the same freezing death he had inflicted on others, stripping away the legal protections he had claimed while demonstrating that true justice sometimes requires stepping outside the comfortable boundaries of written law to address violations so fundamental that they threaten the very foundation of civilized warfare itself. The story of what happened in that medical tent in Bastogne in December 1944 remains a stark reminder that the rules of war exist not to be exploited by the clever and the ruthless, but to protect the vulnerable and preserve the dignity of soldiers who fight with honor. And when those rules are violated in ways that make a mockery of their intent, the response must be swift, clear, and severe enough to ensure that such violations never happen again. If you enjoyed this video, hit the like button and subscribe for more history content covering wars, revolutions, and events that shaped the modern world.